Is it a blessing or a curse to feel everything so deeply?
It's both, I think. It's a blessing and a curse. So I suppose the benefit it delivers is an expanded scope of experience. And it's possible as well that if it was done well, it would be better than anything. But if it isn't done well, it's very, very punishing. So I think you can make that case about self-consciousness in people. I mean, self-consciousness as a trait loads on neuroticism. So, and when people say I became self-conscious, they usually mean they've become embarrassed or anxious, right? And those things do overlap to a tremendous degree. So self-consciousness per se as an experienced phenomenon is associated with negative emotion. Well, but do you want to dispense with it? Well, no, because it's really informative, but you don't want to experience it. So if you're made self-conscious by one of your inadequacies, you want to remove the inadequacy, you don't want to remove the self-consciousness. But it can get out of hand too. People can be so self-conscious and so self-critical that they can't move forward. So it can definitely be, you can have too much of that, that's for sure. And it's one of the things you do as a behavior therapist, again, a cognitive behavior therapist, is if you have someone who's particularly self-conscious, there'll be a litany in their head of all of their inadequacies. And so it's like they have an inner tormentor that just constantly natters at them about how useless and weak and inadequate they are. And there's a lot of stock arguments that repeat. And one of the things you do with someone who is in that situation is you have them write down all their self-critical thoughts, and you do that dialectically. You help them over many sessions make a complete account, and then you help them develop counter arguments. Not false counter arguments, but you go after it. It's like, well, is that really true? And here's the evidence that it's not. And so you can bolster people against the consequences of self-consciousness gone amok. And that's often quite effective.
Where does that
it's
voice
difficult, though.
Where does that voice tend to come from?
Well, it's probably, at least in part, the inevitable consequence of being a creature who's continually being socially evaluated. So you have a voice inside that's something like the abstracted average of everyone's criticism of everyone. And that's useful because it reminds you not to do things that other people are going to object to. It also, assuming your culture is reasonably functional, it also reminds you not to do things that are going to be counterproductive. And so that's one source. It's like interiorized public opinion. And then other sources are, well, it's also the voice of your ideals. And that in that sense, you might consider it your conscience. And that can be, well, that's extraordinarily useful because it points out your shortcomings. Now, one of the things I've analyzed the movie Pinocchio sort of ad nauseum, I would say, but it's been very useful to me. One of the things that's so remarkable about that movie is that the voice of the conscience, which is portrayed by Jiminy Cricket, is symbolically associated with Jesus Christ in the movie. And but interestingly enough, there's a dialectical relationship between the puppet, the wooden-headed puppet, whose strings are being pulled by external forces, and the conscience. So despite the voice of the conscience being symbolically associated with Christ, the conscience has something to learn during the journey as well. And so there's like a dialogue between the conscience and the developing individual, and the consequence of the dialogue is the conscience gets more effective as the person becomes more developed. And I think that's right, because imagine that you have the average ideal inside you speaking to you, and you have the average social voice inside you speaking to you. But it isn't really speaking to you. It isn't taking your particularities into account. And it isn't until you engage with your conscience that you can craft it into something that's actually speaking specifically to you. And then that's much less burdensome and much more effective. And so, and I think that's reasonable, because I don't think the conscience starts out infallible. There's an MBA program at McGill that's targeted to practicing managers, not to MBA students per se. And the man who runs it has asked his students what they found most useful about the program. And what they found most useful was the opportunity to get away from the day-to-day fires of their managerial roles and think about the long run, the medium to long run. Because what happens with most managers is they're so busy putting out day-to-day fires that they never notice in what direction the entire organization or the part they're heading should be, in what direction it should be going. And it's easy for that to happen in our own lives. I mean, I think that's actually why, at least part of the reason why, it's a real loss that so many people no longer attend church. Because, when I was a kid, there was a lot of cynicism, and there still is, about, 1 hour a week Christians. They'd go to church and participate in this elevated ritual that was, at least in principle, oriented towards a higher mode of being, and then promptly return to their, sinful workaday selves the second they stepped out of church. And fair enough, but an hour a week is a lot more than zero. And you could object, well, most people who were going to church weren't engaging in this foundational analysis. It's like, well, at least they were sort of doing it. And replacing that with zero doesn't seem to be a very wise move. And so I guess it's sort of the answer to your own question there too, though, is, you asked about the utility of self-consciousness. It's like, well, you can step back from the traps of your unthinking habits and contemplate the whole journey. My colleagues and I developed this program online to help people do that, to write through their life. So the past authoring program helps people write an autobiography. Who the hell am I anyways? And you think but you don't, because you're complicated. And then the present authoring program helps you identify your faults and your virtues by your own definition. It's not imposed on you. It's a guided process of exploration. And then the future authoring program helps you figure out, well, if you could have what you wanted, hypothetically, what would that actually be? And yes, it's very much worth asking yourself that question, because you're always searching for that anyways, even negatively, because your conscience will torment you for the things you're not doing. Okay, well, not doing in relationship to what? Well, in relationship to the implicit ideal of your conscience. Well, what is that? And the answer is, well, you don't know. And so if you're just allowing yourself to be tortured into submission, then you're at the mercy of some ideal that you don't know. And maybe you wouldn't want to pursue if you actually knew. That's why Carl Jung said, everyone lives out a myth, but virtually no one knows what myth they're living. And maybe it's a tragedy. Maybe you don't want it to be a tragedy. And on the question, what do you want? That's a really deep question. That's a serious question. What is it that you should value? And people say, well, being happy. They don't even mean that, by the way. If you decompose what people mean when they say they want to be happy, what it turns out they actually mean is they don't want to be miserable. They're way more concerned with avoiding suffering than they are with pursuing, enthusiastic, positive emotion. So even the statement, I want to be happy, is actually not an accurate reflection of what it is that you want. Well, we're definitely not transparent to ourselves by any stretch of the imagination. We wouldn't have to spend decades studying psychology if we were transparent. Like we're tremendously mysterious to ourselves. I'm less pessimistic about the executors of our genes, because I think that that pessimistic biological determinism, kind of the pessimism sort of stems from this adoption of the assumption that our genes were tooled by a blind watchmaker, and there's this deterministic, soulless process at the base of our biological being. And I don't buy that. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. So I think even if we are tools of our biology in some sense, the ends at which our biology are aiming are ethical in an unbelievably fundamental way.